Yes, sir.
Sure. I want to ask you on Burundi. There's been a widely publicized, at least in Burundi, order banning and removing the permits of a number of NGOs, including a human rights group run by Pierre Claver Impanimpa and a number of other ones that are basically part of what's called the moderate opposition. So I'm wondering, you said that yesterday that the special advisors' meetings with the foreign minister were constructive. Did they address the disaccrediting of a large portion of civil society?
We're very disappointed by the government's decision to withdraw the permits of a number of NGOs, including the ones you mentioned, and our message to the government is to reconsider it.
But what was constructive about the talks then? Because I asked you about the journalists, and then I asked you about this one. So what, is there some secret kernel of constructivity that took place?
Constructivity is, I think in diplomatic terms, can be interpreted in many different ways. The fact that the talks took place in a constructive atmosphere, I think says it all. Mr. Abadi.
Sure. You said that Mr. Benamar's in Burundi, as maybe you or he knows, there were among the many things happening there is some journalists were arrested reportedly while investigating mass graves. There was an American journalist, J.C. Steers, and a Burundian journalist, Gildas, and their driver. This has been gone out all over the world. There's actually a list that's emerged of enemies of the state put out by the CND-FCC. So what I wonder is, what if he's there and these things are taking place? How do these constructive meetings involve talking about journalists being arrested for trying to document?
We're very much aware of the arrests of the journalists, which is something that's very regrettable, to say the least. We understand that both the journalists and the driver, who was also arrested, have now been released. We are in touch with our colleagues at the Human Rights Office in Bujumbura and trying to look into the exact circumstances of what has happened. It is clear that there is a need for the media and the press to be able to operate freely in Burundi and every other place for that matter.
And what about the list that emerged? Are there any steps being taken by the UN to make sure that the UN itself doesn't target media that are listed on the list?
Well, the UN's not in the business of targeting media. Imoke.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. It's a good report, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask about something very specific in it. I noticed in your catalog of complaints and communications on page 113, you have your letter to Christina Gayach of the Department of Public Information here about her decision to throw Inner City Press out of the UN for covering a meeting in this very room. And so I wanted to know, I've seen her response now, May 25th, where she said that I trespassed in this room covering a meeting of the UN Correspondents Association, which I believe was relevant to the Anglap Sang bribery scandal we wanted to cover. So I wanted to know, what did you, she doesn't mention in there that I've had a minder ever since. Anything on the second floor can only be covered with a minder signed by DPI who asks, who do you want to speak to? So I wanted to know, what did you think of her response? What do you think of the restrictions, of 8 months of such restrictions for seeking to cover a meeting in this room? And what does it take to have the UN live up to the principles that you put forward in your opening statement?
Yeah, so thanks, Matthew. I'd say a couple of things, and I want to start with the last part of your question, which is looking at how the UN lives up to the standards in international human rights law. So we've actually initiated a project, and I should say, when I did the whistleblower protection report last year, we devoted a page or so to whistleblower protection in the UN system. When it comes to access to information, which is your access as journalists, but also the public's access to UN information, generally speaking, we're at the beginning of our study, but generally speaking, I think that the rules around access to information, the rules around journalist access, and maybe not just in headquarters, but throughout the UN ecosystem, are really opaque. It's not clear, I think, to the average person how to get access to information from the UN or from other international organizations. And I think that that relates as well to journalists. And it may be easier in the context of headquarters, where you have a system set up and you have so much news taking place in this building. But the UN is far flung, and it's unclear how one gets information across the board. As far as the specifics, I'm not sure I can characterize my reaction to them, but I would say that it would be useful for me as a rapporteur and someone who's interested in access to information to know a little bit more about process. So, what is the process by which someone is accredited, or, and I know it's not strictly speaking accreditation, but what is the process for accreditation and for the taking away of accreditation? And I think that's something I'd like to explore more with her and with DPI. But it's not just this building's issue. It's something across the board.
Just for your own information, between trying to cover a meeting here on January 29th and being evicted on February 19th, I was never spoken to once. There was absolutely zero due process. So if you make this inquiry, I would encourage you to that could solve a lot of.
Thanks.
Yes, thank